Hi everyone! Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so YouTube keeps showing you more content like this. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, let's begin. It was Thursday, 10 November 2022, at 6:55 p.m. when I turned off the A20 and took Smarden Road toward Pluckley, Kent, the dashboard reading 7 Dostru, and the drizzle turning the hedges into dark wet ribs that leaned over the lane and breathed fog back into my beams. The air inside the car smelled like damp fabric and petrol, and I kept telling myself I was only here for 2 nights, to collect ambient sound for a winter episode. Nothing fancy, just hedgerows in the rain, pub chatter, the way a small place settles after the tourists leave, and maybe a walk along the footpaths of Durring Woods that the internet likes to dress up as the Screaming Woods, while locals just call them by their old name and keep their curtains drawn. And I found the converted oast house by missing it once, doubling back and catching the glint of the lockbox on the whitewashed round wall like a mole on a pale cheek. And when I let myself in the room, felt like the inside of a drum, all curve and echo, and a faint smell of wet wood and old smoke. A little electric radiator crouched by a plug with a warning tag, a narrow staircase climbing at a slant to a bedroom warped like a saucer, left too long in the sun. And I did what I always do in a new place. To keep the mind honest, I said it out loud like I was filing a report. Thursday, 10 November 2022. Temperature 7 Dostru. I can see condensation on the window. I can hear the soft tick of rain on the cowl. And once I had laid the facts down like sandbags, I felt steady enough to hang my coat and check the fridge and put my recorder case on the table and tell myself I would eat at the Black Horse and sleep. Record in the morning, walk the woods in daylight like a sensible person, and not like the sort of idiot who tries to pull a headline out of a hedge at midnight. So, at 7:30, I put my hood up and walked down the street where the lamplight turned the drizzle into strands of glass, and the cottages showed tidy yellow windows, and the pub door breathed beer and wool and vinegar, and a black dog flicked one eye open as I passed, and the landlord, a heavy man in a brown sweater with forearms like barrels, looked me over and said in a voice that belonged to the oak beams, "Evening, you must be the oast." And I said, "How could you tell?" And he tapped his temple and said, "People from the round houses stand like the wall is still behind them." And that made the men at the bar smile into their pints. And I said, "2 nights, just recording the village. I like the ordinary sounds." And one of the men, without looking at me, said, "You'll get foxy," the word laid down like a card. And I said, "I have heard foxes. They can sound like someone is being hurt." And he said, "They sound like what you bring with you." And the landlord slid a pint across with a nod and a plate of chips that hissed where the vinegar hit. And the room pressed around me in that way country pubs have, where you are gently kept and gently weighed at the same time. And when I asked how far to Durring Woods, the landlord said, "Behind your place, follow the hedge, but mind your footing, it's slick." And a woman at a table by the fire looked up from her crossword and said, "Take a scarf." And I must have looked puzzled because she added, "It keeps the damp off your throat. It changes the way you hear yourself." And when I left at 9, the fog lay heavy, a careful white cloth on the fields, and the footpath behind the oast took me along a hawthorn hedge that breathed water, and the recorder clipped to my jacket showed its little red dot, and the headphones poured the night back into my head in real time. So every drip had a weight and every hush had a shape, and then a single cry came from somewhere left and deeper in, quick and thin, like a taut thread parting, and I froze and felt the way cold climbs the ribs from the inside, and told myself fox because that is the first sensible box, and waited. And the second cry came longer with a catch in it that had nothing to do with theatre, and everything to do with a body finding a new edge, and I stood until my cuffs wicked rain, and a car door thudded, far off, like a hand on a wall which made the world ordinary again, and I went inside and made tea, and sat at the round table and listened back, and saw the cry leave on the waveform, like a seam, and heard under it a faint breath, that might have been leaf noise, or might have been the end of a sob. Someone tried to swallow, and I did sleep in the end, that, with the door upstairs drawing in, and releasing with a quiet click every 10 seconds from the draft, through the vent, a metronome that steadied me because I could name it, and at 2 I woke, and listened, and counted the clicks, until sleep came back, like a tide that decided to be kind, and morning was a cold, clear pain at 9:04 a.m., with wood pigeons talking 2 gardens over, and a lorry beep backing near the shop, and I ate a sausage roll under a dripping eave, and bought a scarf because of the woman's voice in my head, about throats, and hearing yourself, and walked the public footpath into Daring Woods, where the mud had a pale clay sheen, and the bracken lay like wet flags, and the trees were old and creased, and the light came down in colorless sheets, and I like to let a place teach me, so I clipped the recorder high, let my breath slow, and followed a narrow suggestion of a path to a small clearing where a stump sat like an altar, and a yew leaned at an angle with bark as black as a burnt kettle, and from a low branch 3 short pieces of garden twine hung in a braid frayed at the end. And I did not like that at all, even though it was nothing, even though it was a child's knot or somewhere to hang fat balls for birds, or a place a man tied tagline for saplings. It had the wrong wit about it, and when I stepped closer, I smelled something faint and sour like old rope in a damp cupboard, and heard, perhaps only because I was waiting, the ghost of that same high cry, somewhere off to the left. And I said, "Hello," because there is something in me that believes in saying plain things in plain tones, and the rook that blew out of the next tree tore the air like slate scraping, and I laughed at myself in a breath that had no humor in it, and found another yew at an angle 50 yards on, with 2 short pieces of twine knotted and hanging like quotation marks, and beneath it the ground scuffed to bare dirt in a neat circle, not dug, just churned by feet. And I did not step into that circle, because every part of me knew that stepping into it would feel like taking off a ring you have worn for years, and setting it down on a table you do not trust. And I walked another hour, with the woods pressing in a patient way, and brought out nothing more than the quiet and the stitch of distant farm noises, and the small pop of water falling from leaf to leaf. And by afternoon I was sure I had let the internet decorate my senses, and I went back to the pub with the scarf soft under my jaw, and the landlord said, "How are the foxes?" And I said, "Soft today," and the fur cone man said, "They keep the noise for the dark," and I said I would do one more run after dusk, and he said, "Mind the hollows, the leaves hide them," and that was care, plain and simple, which did more to worry me than any warning would have, because care means knowing what a place can do to a body. And when night came, it came heavy and quiet, and my breath inside the scarf felt warm and near, and the red light on the recorder made a grain of fire, and the path gave up into slow shadow sound, carrying oddly as if someone had pulled the trees a little closer together, and I made myself patient. I let my mind walk slower than my feet, and the first cry of the night rose from far off in a line so clean it made my skin pull tight across my knuckles, and then there was another, closer, less neat, with that catch that feels like a throat closing against a word. And then between the second and third a voice I knew said, "You're hot on the mic, back it off a touch." And my heart lurched, because it was Mia's voice, clean as a studio note, my producer who was at home 3 hours away with a chest infection, and I said aloud the way a man says a name when the room shows him a trick, and the hedgerow returned a shape that sounded like my name 3 times, the second time wrong in the vowels, as if someone moved their tongue like a map they had never read before. and I felt the urge to swing my torch all the way around and look at everything, and I did not because the woods had become a room with rules, and one of them was that you look where the sound lives, and not where the fear wants. So I kept my eyes on the path and I said, "If there is someone there, say hello. I have a light," and nothing in that space wanted the light except me, and a minute later the cry came again above me. Not from the left or right, but from a notch of darkness higher than the hedge, the sound thinner, the catch longer, and the scarf suddenly felt too tight at the back of my neck. The way a hand can feel when you have not decided whether you have imagined, and I turned in one slow half circle, and put the torch beam low and saw the base of another yew leaning like the others, and two short lengths of pale twine hanging neat and stupid from a branch I could reach if I jumped. And in that moment a breath that was not mine moved the fine hairs along my jaw, and the old rope smell lifted like a cupboard door opening, and I heard the weightless sound a rope makes when it unwinds from itself. Not creak, not groan, a soft release like hands letting go, and I said again without meaning to say it, "Hello," and from the other side of the trunk a man's voice said very quietly, "Don't look up." And the way he said it was not warning and not threat. It was the plain advice of a person who has learned what he is saying by failing at it, and that scared me in a clean way because it made a human out of the dark, and I said, "Where are you?" And the voice said, "Do not look up," and then said my name in a way that meant he knew how to read it off something and not how to say it with his mouth. And I did what you do when someone tells you that. I looked up. I would like to pretend I did not. But I tilted the torch, and the beam caught on wet bark, and a fork of branch, and on nothing else, and there was no face, and no rope, and no shape that made sense of the noise, and then right in my ear there came the shortest copy of a scream I have ever heard, not even a scream. The start of one, the intake and the first blade of it, and it was behind the skin of my ear where your pulse lives, and I lurched back and my boot slid, and I put my hand on the trunk, and felt a groove worn into it at exactly the height where a single body would polish wood over time, a smooth band in the rough bark that had no business being that even in that place, and I ran. Then, because running is a tool and I will not pretend it is cowardice, I got myself out of that clearing with my light on my feet and the hedge on my left, and as I ran, I heard footsteps matching mine, a beat, late, not the crackle of my own sound coming back because this was heavy, a weight, and when I reached the stile by the field, the steps stopped and the night pulled back into ordinary cold, and I took 3 full breaths, leaning on wet wood, and looked at the recorder light, and it winked like nothing had happened, except I noticed the little screen showed a battery should not have had, full bars where there should have been 2. And I walked the rest and went inside and locked the door and went up the warped stairs and lay on the mattress and listened to the vent, drawer and release, and counted the clicks, and the old rope smell came as a memory does when it wants to be a fact, and somewhere between one count and the next, the click stopped and something above the ceiling gave the faintest sound that is not a creak and not a pop, a tension easing, a weight that had been kept and then set down an inch, and I do not care how that sound. I lay there with my hands flat on the blanket, and I did not move until the light in the window went from black to deep grey to the color of chalk, and in the day my courage came back with the sparrows, and I drove to the church, because the churchyard is where you go when you want the living to put their hands on the dead's shoulder and keep them quiet, and the caretaker, a spare man with rain in his eyebrows, saw my recorder and said, "We get your sort," and I said, "I am after the ordinary sounds, the bees and the boots," and he said, "There are fewer bees now," and I asked about the woods, and he looked toward them without turning his head and said, "They were daring long before they were anything else. The family did things their way," and I asked what way that was, and he said, "They closed what ought to be open, and opened what ought to stay shut." And I said, "I heard something like a man telling me not to look up." And he said without humor, "That is a kindness if you ever get one, be grateful." And when I asked if he had ever heard the scream, he said, "People hear what they bring. Foxes bring fox. A guilty man brings a knock at the door. A lonely one brings a voice that knows his name. And I thanked him, and he said, "No need, just be gone by full dark." And at the shop I saw the woman in the green coat again, and she asked if I had worn the scarf, and I said I had. And she said, "Good, it keeps your breath where it should be." And I did my last pass in the late afternoon when the light goes the color of tin, and I told myself I would stand on the footpath only, and not step into any clearings, and not look at anything hanging from anything. I set the recorder to run into a backup on my phone because some part of me wanted a second set of eyes on the noise, and I stood while the world thinned out to a point where sound moved like syrup, and the first cry rose and fell, and I said, "I am here, because you should tell a place the truth." And a man's voice 3 trees back said, "I know," and a woman's voice said, "He should not be cold," in the tone you use when a child has forgotten his coat, the tone you keep for people you think are yours. And the 2 pieces of twine at the last U hung without moving in a wind that was not there, and the old rope smell came and changed to the smell of wet hair, not mine. And the voice that had borrowed Mia's shape tried to say my name again, and made it into a smaller word with a hard middle, and I stepped backward slow, until my heel felt the stile, and I was proud of myself for keeping the torch low, and for not looking up, and for not saying any of the names crowding my mouth. And I went home and packed and set an alarm for dawn, and slept with the scarf on because the room felt too large for my throat, and at 2:11 I woke to the vent clicking, and this time the click counted 2, and then paused, and then counted 2 as if someone were listening for my count. And above the ceiling, something eased an inch again, and the mattress gave a breath, like a man who has been leaning against a door decides to move. And when morning made the window a dull coin, I left the key in the lockbox, and drove out without touching the brake, more than I had to, because the lane felt like it wanted a reason to keep me. And at home I did the thing you do when you want to make the past into an object. I loaded the files and I put on the good headphones, and I stared at the waveform until my eyes crossed, and the first night's cry lived where I remembered, and the second night's held the hitch, and the breath, and the little sliver of my name said wrong. And then in the third file, the last run, the backup, my phone captured and sent to the cloud without asking me, like a helpful child who has just made a mess. I heard something that does not make any sense in any room I own. Behind the first cry there was a voice speaking in a careful rhythm like a list, and I knew the voice before I knew the words, because it was my voice, the one I use when I lay down facts to keep my mind honest, and the words were the ones I said when I walked into the Oast House on Thursday night. Thursday, 10 November 2022, 6:05 p.m. Pluckley, Kent. Light drizzle, temperature 7 condensation on the window, soft tick of rain on the cowl. Only the breath between the numbers stuttered, like a person with a rope under his jaw trying not to bump it. And when I scrubbed forward to the minute where I stood under the last U, and the stranger told me not to look up, I heard a new sound that had not come through my bones at the time, the faint, soft release of a loop tightening and then easing, the small back and forth weight of something that is not furniture, and then the last second, the one where I climbed the stile, and something heavy did not follow. The file picked up a whisper right against the mic that I did not feel on my skin, a whisper in the wrong mouth making a simple sentence. We keep what looks up, and I shut the laptop and went into the hall where the air felt thin, and smelled my coat, and there was the faint sour trace of wet rope, and when I shook the scarf, a single pale hair fell, that was not mine, and smelled like old smoke after rain. And I am writing this because 3 nights ago, at 2:11 a.m., in my flat, an interior vent I have never noticed began to draw and release, with a soft click, 2 counts and a pause, 2 counts and a pause, and when I laid down facts out loud to steady my mind, The sound above the ceiling gave that small easing inch, as if someone had been waiting for me to remember how I do it, and I know the ordinary explanations and I respect them, and I have lined them up and counted them as carefully as I counted the clicks. But I am leaving the scarf in a drawer and I am not looking up, and when the night goes very still and far away, a fox might scream in the alley below, and I will repeat the name Fox like a charm, and when it comes from above instead, and is shorter and has the catch that makes the stomach understand before the brain does, I will not move, and I will not look, and I will wait for the morning to fold itself over me, like a tired coat, and I will get up and make tea and pretend the day is a dawn. And if you play the file with good headphones and careful hands, you will hear my voice again laying out the date and the time as if by speaking them. I built a little room and left the door open, and if you are wise you will not stand under anything that leans while you listen. It was late autumn when I decided to spend a few nights in Derbyshire. I had been reading about plague villages for months, while working on a small research project about collective sacrifice in history, and was the most famous. The story is simple and tragic. When the plague reached the village in 1665, the people sealed themselves off from the outside world to stop it spreading. Nearly all of them died, but they contained it. Historians praise their bravery, but the village is still scarred by what happened. I wanted to see it for myself, to walk those lanes and feel whatever weight lingered there. I arrived on the 12th of November 2022. It was a Saturday, a little past 4 in the afternoon, and the sky was already dimming into that heavy blue that hangs over English hills in late fall. The air smelled of wet leaves and chimney smoke. I parked near the square and checked into a small cottage rental I had found online. The landlady was polite but quick, and I noticed she avoided much eye contact. When she handed me the keys, she said, "You'll want to be inside before dark. Cold sets in quick up here." It sounded less like advice about weather and more like something else, but I didn't press. The cottage was neat, modernized just enough to be comfortable. Radiators ticked, the windows rattled faintly when the wind pushed against them. Outside, felt impossibly still. The houses looked too clean, almost staged, with plaques nailed to their walls naming the families who once lived and died inside. The Thorpe family, all perished 1666. John Blackwell, his wife and 3 children, each one marked a grave that wasn't a grave, a death where the bodies never left. Standing there, I felt like I was trespassing on private grief. The air did feel heavier, as if the dampness carried weight. My phone signal cut in and out until it vanished entirely. I walked the village lanes until twilight closed in. It was quiet except for the occasional crow. The locals who passed me barely nodded, and I noticed every door shut tight. Curtains drawn, though it wasn't even 5 yet. By the time I made it back to the cottage, the lamps outside had flickered on, casting yellow cones of light over stone walls slick with rain. I locked the door and made tea, trying to shake the unease. That was when I first heard it, a sound so faint I wasn't sure it was real. A woman crying, not loud, not the kind of sobbing you'd expect, but a soft, stifled weeping, like someone muffling themselves into fabric. It drifted in from outside, or maybe from the adjoining wall of the cottage. I froze, holding my breath, straining to tell. When I moved to the window, the lane outside was empty, only rain dripping from the eaves. The sound faded, and I told myself it was the wind through the stonework, or maybe my mind primed by all the history I had been reading. Still, that night I kept the television on, while I worked on my notes. Around 11, I stepped out onto the back patio to smoke. The village was utterly silent. No cars, no voices, no distant hums of nightlife, just damp air pressing against me. As I stood there, I noticed movement in an upper window across the lane. A figure, pale against the glass, unmoving. At first I thought it was a mannequin, but then I realized it was a woman, or the shape of one. She stood perfectly still, watching, though I could not make out her features. When I blinked, the window was empty. I put my cigarette out and went back inside, locking the door again. The second day I spent walking the boundary stone, where villagers left coins in vinegar to trade for food during quarantine. The countryside was beautiful in a muted, bleak way, fields rolling into mist, stone walls zigzagging over hills. But I couldn't shake how the village itself felt hollow, as if its heart had been scooped out centuries ago, and nothing had filled it since. I spoke briefly with a shopkeeper, an older man who sold postcards and trinkets. I asked him if he had lived there long. He nodded, but when I pressed further about the village's reputation, his face tightened. "Best to leave the dead alone," he said, "especially here." That was all he gave me. That night, the crying came again, louder, clearer, a woman's voice, right outside the window by my bed. I sat up, pulse hammering, and for a moment I could swear I heard words. "Help me." I switched on the lamp and looked out. The street was empty, rainwater pooling in the cobblestones, no footprints, no movement. I shut the curtains and left the light on, but I didn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, the crying stopped, but I began hearing something else. Footsteps upstairs, slow, dragging, deliberate. My cottage had only 1 floor. I lay frozen until dawn, clutching the duvet like a child. By the 3rd day I was running on no sleep. I told myself I would leave that evening, cut the trip short, but part of me wanted to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. At dusk, I walked again, past the plaques and darkened cottages, until I reached the churchyard. The ground was uneven with centuries of graves, the stones leaning and weathered, the sky bruised purple. And as the bells tolled 6, I heard it again, that same weeping, closer now, threading through the gravestones. I whispered out loud without thinking, "Where are you?" And for the briefest second I saw movement between 2 crooked stones. A woman, head bowed, face hidden by tangled hair. When I stepped closer, she was gone, leaving only the impression that the air was colder where she had been. I didn't stay that night. I drove off before darkness swallowed the hills, the road winding me out of the valley. My phone signal returned miles away, and with it came a lightness in my chest I hadn't realized I'd lost. I never went back to IM, but sometimes when I wake in the night, I swear I hear that same stifled weeping outside my window, soft and desperate, waiting for help that never came. And the worst part is, I'm not in Derbyshire anymore. It was late September of 2019 when I decided to take a detour on my way back from Exeter and visit Berry Pomeroy Castle. I had heard about the place for years, the White Lady, the Blue Lady, and all the guidebook ghost stories that were repeated with tourist enthusiasm, but I'd never gone myself. That day was cold but dry, the kind of crisp autumn afternoon when the clouds hang low and the light feels heavier than it should. I reached the entrance just after 4 p.m, and the man at the ticket booth warned me I didn't have long. The castle closed at 5. I remember glancing at my watch and thinking an hour was enough. I wasn't planning on staying long anyway. The castle ruins rose above the surrounding woods like broken teeth, jagged stone walls cut against a slate-colored sky. Even in daylight it was darker there, the shadows thick where they should have been soft. I thought at first it was just the trees, the sun dropping lower, but when I stepped inside the first arch, I felt something change. It wasn't colder exactly, it was flatter, like the air had no depth. Sounds dulled too. The crunch of gravel under my shoes seemed smaller, as if the space itself was pressing inward. I walked through the remains of the great hall, the open courtyard, the stairwell that led to nothing. There were a few other visitors, a couple with a dog, and an older man who was sketching the ruins in a notebook. Everyone kept their voices low. I told myself it was because of the history of the place, but it felt more like being inside a church you didn't believe in, but couldn't quite disrespect. By 4:30, most people had left. The couple with the dog passed me near the dungeons, and the woman smiled faintly, saying, "Don't stay too long, it gets dark fast here." I laughed politely, though I didn't really think she was joking. At 4:40 I found myself standing near the outer wall, looking through a collapsed section where the wood seemed to climb right into the stone. I pulled out my phone to take a photo, but the screen glitched, not froze, not dimmed, but shifted, as if the light on the display was being pulled sideways. I thought maybe it was the low signal, but I wasn't even connected to the internet at the time. That's when I noticed it. The stones weren't reflecting the fading sunlight the way they should have. They were darker, absorbing the light, drinking it in until the air around them looked thinner. It reminded me of the way heat shimmers off asphalt, except it wasn't heat. It was the opposite. I heard footsteps behind me and turned, expecting to see the sketching man leaving. The courtyard was empty. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was spooking myself with all the stories I'd read. I walked back toward the entrance, planning to leave a few minutes before closing, but the way out didn't look right. The path was there, but the light was wrong. The late afternoon should have been casting long golden shadows across the gravel, but instead it was flat, grey, as if the sun had already gone. The air smelled like wet stone, even though it hadn't rained in days. I checked my watch. 4:48. I still had time. I kept walking. Halfway to the gate I heard a voice, faint but clear, a woman's voice, calling low, "Come back." It wasn't threatening, not even pleading. It was soft, careful, like someone coaxing a child to return inside. I froze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice bouncing strangely against the walls. No answer. Just the quiet, thick and heavy. Then the lights started. Not lamps or torches, nothing physical. It was as if the walls themselves were glowing from within. A dim, bluish radiance bled through the cracks in the stone, the empty windows, the broken stairwell. It wasn't bright enough to see by, but bright enough to notice, like a faint lantern underwater. My chest tightened. I thought of the stories I'd heard from locals, the warnings no guidebook printed, that sometimes the castle wasn't empty at night, that sometimes it lit up, as if life still moved inside it, and that the light itself wasn't passive, it was hungry. I wanted to run, but couldn't. My legs carried me forward, almost against my will, closer to the courtyard again. The glow pulsed faintly. For a second it looked like people were moving in the shadows, shifting shapes behind ruined walls, figures where there couldn't be figures. I forced myself to stop, to turn, to walk fast toward the exit. The air thickened around me as I neared the arch, as if I were moving through water. My breath came sharp, each inhale heavier than it should have been. My watch read 4. As I stepped under the arch, I heard the voice again, much closer now, a whisper right by my ear. "Don't leave yet." I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, the last in the gravel lot. My hands shook so hard I dropped the keys twice before I got the door open. When I finally drove away, I didn't look back. But here's the part that still keeps me awake sometimes. When I got home and plugged in my phone, I noticed there was one photo in my gallery from that afternoon. Just one. I hadn't pressed the shutter. The image was of the courtyard, glowing faintly with that bluish light, and in the center of the photo, just at the edge of clarity, was a figure, a woman in pale clothes, face blurred, hand raised as if reaching toward the camera. I deleted the photo immediately, or I thought I did. Every few months it shows back up, different folder, different name, always the same photo, always the same woman reaching, and every time, the glow is just a little brighter. It was Christmas Eve 2019 in Prestbury, Gloucestershire, and I still remember the cold that night in a way I can't shake. The air had that crisp bite you only get in English villages during winter, where every sound carries further than it should. I'd come down from Cheltenham to spend the holiday with my aunt, who lives just off the high street, in a red brick cottage that always smells faintly of wood smoke and lavender polish. Prestbury has a charm most places would kill for. All honey-coloured stone, narrow lanes, and crooked old pubs that look like they've been standing since the Norman conquest. But under all that postcard beauty there's a heaviness you feel if you're paying attention, and I'd been warned about it since I was a kid. The locals say Prestbury is one of the most haunted villages in England. Tourists talk about it sometimes, but the villagers don't. Not really. My aunt used to tell me never to look out of the window on Christmas, Easter, or All Saints' Day. She'd say it matter-of-factly, like telling me not to put a fork in the toaster. "Those are his nights," she'd say, meaning the Black Abbot. I thought it was just folklore, the same way Whitby has Dracula and Cornwall has smugglers' ghosts. But here, it isn't worn like a badge. It's whispered, almost like people are afraid the story itself might notice them if they say too much. That night after dinner, my aunt went up to bed around 10. I stayed downstairs in the sitting room, nursing a whiskey by the fire and scrolling through my phone. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches, and every so often the church bells would give a half-muffled clang when a gust caught the ropes. Around 11:30 I went to the window just to peek out. The lane was empty, the kind of stillness that feels staged, like the world is holding its breath. Snow had started to fall, a fine powder catching in the glow of the street lamp at the corner. I should have listened to her, I know that now. At first I noticed nothing unusual, just the stone wall lining the lane and the churchyard beyond it, black and silent. Then, a shift, like when someone steps into your peripheral vision. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. Down the path that cut through the graves, something moved. It wasn't a shape you could mistake for a dog or a person. It was taller, heavy-robed, with its hood drawn low, walking slowly as if each step had to be remembered. The snow didn't crunch beneath it. It didn't seem to disturb the air at all. And then came the pressure. It started in my chest, faint, like the moment you realize you've been holding your breath too long. It tightened, spreading through my ribs, up into my throat, until swallowing hurt. I wanted to look away, to back from the glass, but I could. My eyes locked to the slow, deliberate progress of that hooded figure. Somewhere in the fog of panic, I remembered the warning. If you see his face, he will come to your bedside. The figure stopped, not at the end of the path, not among the crooked headstones, but directly opposite my aunt's cottage. Slowly, it turned its head. Even from that distance, I felt the weight of it. I never saw a face, just the suggestion of where one should be, darker than the night around it. My vision swam, and I stumbled back from the window so hard I knocked over the glass on the sill. The sound of it shattering seemed to break whatever hold it had. I scrambled upstairs, heart hammering so violently I thought I'd faint. My aunt was standing in the hall in her nightdress, eyes wide and furious. "You looked, didn't you?" she hissed. I couldn't even answer. My chest ached like I'd run a marathon, every breath shallow and ragged. She didn't comfort me. She just grabbed my arm, pulled me into the spare room, and made me lie down. Before she left, she muttered, "Keep your eyes shut, no matter what you hear." I didn't sleep, not really. I lay there, covers pulled to my chin, every nerve screaming. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the stairs creak, soft, deliberate steps, one at a time. They came up the landing, pausing outside my door. The latch clicked, but the door didn't open. Instead, I felt it, the presence in the room, heavier than the darkness, heavier than my own body on the mattress. My chest seized again, that same crushing pressure, like invisible hands pressing me flat. I kept my eyes shut, though everything in me begged to open them. The air turned cold, so cold my teeth chattered. For what felt like hours, it stood there, watching. When dawn came, the weight lifted. The floorboards creaked again, moving away this time. When I dared to open my eyes, the room was empty. pale morning light, filtering through the curtain. My aunt didn't mention it at breakfast, and neither did I. I left Prestry that afternoon, taking an earlier train than planned. I haven't been back since, but every Christmas Eve, without fail, I wake at 2 in the morning, and every time I feel the faintest pressure on my chest, like fingers just beginning to curl. I never open my eye. It was last October when I went to Pendle, Lancashire, the so-called Witches' Hills. I hadn't planned it as a ghost hunt or anything dramatic like that. I had been working in Manchester for a few weeks on a short contract and wanted somewhere quieter for the weekend. Pendle came up on a travel site: green hills, stone cottages, local ale, and trails for walking. The pictures looked calm, and after weeks of office noise and city streets, it seemed perfect. I booked a small bed and breakfast in Barley, a little village at the foot of Pendle Hill, and drove out early on a Saturday morning. The weather was exactly what you'd expect in Lancashire in mid-October: damp, a thin fog clinging to the fields, the air sharp enough that you could see your breath. The roads narrowed as I left the main motorways, hemmed in by stone walls, slick with moss. Sheep dotted the hills, and their white shapes shifted in the mist, as if they were trying to disappear into it. When I pulled up to the bed and breakfast, a 2-story stone house with a slate roof, the owner, a woman in her 60s named Margaret, greeted me with the kind of warmth that makes you feel like you're staying at your aunt's. She asked if I was in the area for the history. I thought she meant the countryside, the old cottages, maybe even the Civil War connections, but the way she said it, with her voice dropping just a little, I knew she was hinting at the witches. I laughed politely and said I wasn't there for ghost stories. She didn't laugh back. She only asked me as she handed me my key not to wander too far up the hill after dark. She said the fog comes down quick and the paths aren't forgiving. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, and sometimes the hill calls back when you call out. Don't answer if it isn't a voice you know. I smiled again, but it sat uncomfortably in my chest. The day passed easily enough. I hiked a few of the trails, stopping to take photos of stone walls broken and leaning, sheep bells tinkling in the distance, and the wide sweep of the valley below. The sun never fully burned through the mist, so everything had that washed-out pale grey look. Around 4 in the afternoon, I headed back down and stopped at the village pub. The place smelled of wood smoke and spilled beer, warm and lived. A couple of locals at the bar looked up when I walked in. The bartender asked if I was staying in the village, and when I told him where, he nodded knowingly. "Margaret'll take care of you," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "Just don't go looking for what doesn't want to be found." I assumed it was more local theatre for tourists. By the time I left the pub, the sky had gone a deep indigo, the air was colder, the mist thickening again. I should have gone straight back to the B&B, but something in me wanted one more walk before bed, just a short one up the lower slope of Pendle Hill. The path was easy to follow at first, lined with low stone walls and wooden stile. The grass was damp under my boots, and the smell of wet earth was heavy. My phone's clock said 7:12 p.m. when I reached a small flat clearing, and that's when I first noticed how quiet it was. No sheep, no distant cars, not even the wind through the grass, just my breathing and the crunch of my boots. I decided to turn back, but as I did, I heard someone call my name, clear as anything. "Daniel." My stomach clenched. It was a woman's voice, but not one I recognized. I froze, scanning the mist. Nothing moved. I told myself it had to be a trick of sound, maybe someone farther down the path calling someone else. I stood there until the silence settled back in, then started walking quickly downhill. After maybe a minute I heard it again, closer this time. "Daniel." The voice was low, almost coaxing, like someone trying not to startle me. My chest tightened. I knew Margaret's words were just folklore, but they came rushing back. Don't answer if it isn't a voice you know. I didn't answer. I just walked fast. My boots slipped once on the wet grass, and I caught myself on the stone wall, scraping my palm. My breath came in sharp clouds. I told myself if I just reached the first stile, I'd be fine. I could see the faint outline of it through the mist. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, steady, matching mine. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I turned, but the mist was too thick to see more than a few yards. Nothing was there. I forced myself forward, trying not to run, but the footsteps started again. And this time they didn't stop when I did. They grew quicker, like someone was closing the distance. I bolted. The stile came into view, and I vaulted it, nearly catching my coat on the wood. When I landed on the other side, I didn't hear the footsteps anymore, just my own gasping breath and the distant trickle of water from some unseen stream. I didn't stop moving until the lights of the village showed through the mist. By the time I reached Margaret's front door, my legs were shaking. She must have heard me fumbling with the lock, because she opened the door before I could find the key. Her eyes went straight to my face, then to my scraped hand. She didn't ask what happened. She just said, "You heard it, didn't you?" I wanted to deny it, but I couldn't. She pressed a cup of hot tea into my hands and told me again, "Never answer." I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard my name whispered, right next to the bed. In the early hours of the morning, just before dawn, I woke to the sound of someone walking down the hall outside my room. Slow, deliberate steps. The floor creaked, then went silent. I lay there stiff, staring at the crack under the door, half expecting to see shadows pause there. Nothing did, but I didn't sleep again. The next morning Margaret didn't mention it. Neither did I. I left Pendle later that day, driving back toward Manchester, with the radio turned up too loud, trying to shake off the feeling. But I swear, sometimes when I'm walking home late at night now, even back in the city, I'll hear it again, just faintly. My name, drawn out low, carried on a breath of air that doesn't move the leaves or stir the litter on the ground. I never turn around, and I never answer.